Good morning. I'm Balaji Ranganathan from the Central University of Gujarat, and the topics I'll be talking on today concerns deconstruction and postmodernism. We all realize that after the advent of post-structuralism that is happening, or has happened since the 1960s and is happening today, deconstruction in a larger sense has become very, very important, especially in the field of literary criticism and literary studies. The entire concept of deconstruction was brought out by Jacques Derrida in two of his major works of grammatology and disseminations. And before we begin to understand what exactly Derrida is talking about within deconstruction, we need to understand the notion and the idea of the term logos, because Derrida is going to critique the entire notion of logocentrism. There has been a very interesting statement that has been made when they said the entire Western philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. Plato did not originate the notion of logos, yes, but logos is very much a part of Greek philosophy, and largely the concept of logos has dominated Western philosophy. When we try and understand logos as an important term in philosophy, it's also very, very apparent in areas like psychology, rhetoric, and religion. Originally, logos meant a ground, a plea, an opinion, or an expectation. It also meant word and speech, an account or reason. It became a very technical term in philosophy, and this began with Heraclitus, who used the term logos as a principle of order and knowledge. Because when we talk about philosophy, we are talking about knowledge, or rather structured and ordered knowledge. If I try and understand how Plato talks about logos, we have to understand Western philosophy as a basic distinction between matter and substance. When I talk about matter, I'm talking about reality, in the sense, how does one view reality or the world around us? There has been a huge and a very long debate within Western philosophy on the status of matter. So, if we end up examining Western philosophy, we will realize that matter and logos has largely been divided into two camps of philosophers. One would be those who support the idea of matter, and others who would consider that matter is basically the spirit. So largely Western philosophy is constructed around the binaries of matter substance versus the spirit. Plato, in a large number of works, whether it was the Phaedrus, Ion, and the Republics, he talked about the notion of forms. Now, what do I mean by the form? Plato means a state of idealism. He's talking about an ideal state of affairs, somewhere a state where everything originates, and everything, what we term as reality, is but a reflection of the form. In that sense, reality is subordinated to this super idealistic source of everything, of matter, spirit, and the world around us. So the notion of forms, what he talks about, is largely apparent when he's using the imagery of the cave within his work, The Republics. Plato talks about a cave, and he's talking about a set of prisoners, or rather people who are bound, who are made to face the wall, and a fire is lit behind them. And what the prisoners do observe is basically the shadows that are apparent on the wall. And in a larger sense, they are disconnected from reality around them, and as a result, they begin considering appearance, in the sense the shadows on the wall, as the appearance and probably the only reality that they know. It's only when they are brought out of the cave and they start observing the real world do they actually understand that reality within Plato, or reality, is not exactly what we assume it to be, but reality is what we construct. So in that sense, the Platonic notion of the form is largely something that has dominated the ideas of Plato and has largely dominated criticism downwards, especially with the Neoplatonists. And this is an effect that you will find ranging right up to post-structuralism, with Saussure and Derrida both dealing with the notion of form. Derrida will decenter, will deconstruct, will critique the notion of this form, what he terms as the presence. So the ideal form is not exactly what we assume. In the sense, we tend to construct reality. And this is something we will understand when I start talking about Saussure. And Saussure, when he brings about the notion of the sign, the signifier, and the signified, when he talks about the referentiality of language, when he starts talking about the arbitrary nature of language, and this is something that we will understand when we grapple with this problem of the form and the reality. So if I just sum up what Plato is talking about with the notion of logos, it means that the world that we live in, the reality that we live in, is a mediated reality. In the sense, reality is not what is apparent outside you. Reality is something that we construct. Reality is something that is mediated. Reality is something that is given to you. So in that sense, that would mean that there is nothing that is ever independent of the logos. So the logos assumes complete primacy in Western philosophy as the originator of all, as the source of everything, that what we term as knowledge, as something that is complete and something that is not replicable. It, in a larger sense, makes reality subordinated to it. This is the reason why in the Republics, Plato talks about the poet, the status of the poet, and how he ends up banishing the poets from his Republics, especially with his notion and the theory of mimesis. What Plato assumes as mimesis, when he talks about poetry, as something that is derivative, that is twice removed from reality, and that is because the essence of poetry is already present within the logos. And being present in the logos, which would obviously mean God, it would only be a copy of a copy. So in that sense, a poet does not construct something really new, but can only make an approximation of something in that ideal state, in that ideal world, that is logos. As a result, Plato would assume that poets need not or should not be a part of his republics. And that's a devastating critique Plato makes against poets and poetry in general. And this is something where Aristotle, within his Poetics, will make a strong defense of poetry. The problem about poetry and the status of art and the status of poetry is something that has largely dominated English criticism, especially when you look at how there's always this urge to defend poetry, especially after Plato critiqued it. So we have the apology for poetry with Sidney, we have the defense of poetry with Shelley, and so on and so forth. So there's always this urge to defend the true status of poetry. In the sense, the utilitarian view that Plato took against poetry is something that most of the artists that follow, most of the philosophers that follow, have always sought to defend, have always sought to rectify that basic bias that Plato has. And what we assume as bias, we must also understand, is something that we accuse Plato of, but taking a larger view as to what should be the status of the republics, we can excuse Plato in that sense, because Plato was talking about a state, a republic, which would be comprised of individuals who in a larger sense are useful to the state. So in that sense, Plato's critique of art, remember, is something that is excluded from the state, but it doesn't mean that Plato derides poetry. He doesn't do that in a very clear sense of terms, but that's a larger understanding that we have. And the larger understanding that brings us to the state that there's nothing independent of logos. Now let me come down to a very key term within deconstruction, that is logocentrism. Now logocentrism was a term that was coined by the German philosopher Ludwig Klages in the 1920s. Now what it actually means is that the tradition of Western science and philosophy situates logos, or the word, or the shabda, or the act of speech, as something that is epistemologically superior. Now, epistemology would mean the science of meaning. In the sense, logocentrism informs you that logos, or speech, or the word, is something that is central. Now, this raises many problems for us. In the sense, if speech is something that is central, then how do we understand writing? Now this is going to be a major argument, because much of Western philosophy after Plato has always centered speech as something that is central, something that is authentic, because this entire debate between speech and writing is about the authenticity of experience. Because the moment speech disappears, then you don't have an authentic experience, because an authentic experience is the moment. Yes? So what happens at that particular moment, and something that actually approximates that moment, something that explains that moment, something that decides that moment, that would be the authentic experience. Everything else after that would be a mediated one, somewhere where thought comes in the process of writing. You have the time to reflect. Now this is something most of us should try to connect, most of us should connect with Wordsworth, and especially when in the lyrical ballads, when he's talking about poetry as being something spontaneous, at the same time he says that is mediated after a due process of thought. So how authentic would that experience be? So that's a larger critique of Wordsworth that we talk about when we come down to the 19th century. But the moment we talk about Western philosophy and Western science, then you have the word, the act of speech as something central. Now, if you have the third point on the slide, if you have a Platonic ideal or a Platonic ideal form, then it must be an ideal representation, or there must be an ideal representation of such a form. In the sense, the world that we see, Plato told you, is something that's a reflection of that logos, something that's a reflection of that state of perfection. Yes? So if you have an ideal state of form, then you need an ideal representation of that form. Now this representation, according to logocentrism, is logos. So logos assumes complete supremacy. All right? Logocentrism also tells you, I'll be introducing a new term right now, a term called presence. There are two terms, presence and absence. When I talk about presence, I'm talking about the moment. When I talk about the moment, I'm talking about that state of knowledge which is authentic experience. Yes? The moment I talk about absence, then we're talking about a state where there might not be a center. And this is where Derrida will be talking about, or he'll be critiquing Western philosophy. He'll also be critiquing Saussure and the entire notion of linguistics that came about. And he'll also be critiquing the basic bedrock of philosophy, logocentrism. Because as I told you before, in the beginning of my talk, there's a very popular statement that Plato made in the entire discipline of Western philosophy a footnote to his argument. Now, what do I mean by logocentrism, and how is it useful for us as students of literature, as teachers of literature, as students and teachers of language? Now, especially when we're coming to language studies and linguistics, let me talk about a very popular book called Literary Theory, A Very Short Introduction by Jonathan Culler. And he's mentioning something very, very interesting. I'll try and explain parts of this as I move on with my talk. Now, what he is talking about in this particular quote is that Western philosophy has always distinguished reality from appearance. So, as I said, reality as logos, as something that is the authentic, as something that is primordial, and appearance. Appearance in the sense, a representation which is mimetic. Something that is a copy, something that is a derivative, a part of derivative knowledge. All right? So, Western philosophy has always distinguished reality and appearance and the representations. And linguistics functions on the notion of the sign. Right? So in the sense, representations are signs. So, if we need to get down to the entire problem within linguistics, then we must understand that what would be logos within language? What would be the moment within language? What would be that authentic source or that authentic form of experience within language? Like, when I am talking to you, then what would be the authentic thing? Would it be a recording of this, or would it be the moment when I am speaking? So if I am speaking right now, that would be the authentic truth, because I am I, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That's what Descartes had mentioned. Then what would be this recording? What would be that moment of time that takes between the studio and your television set in your colleges? There's a time gap. And because of this time gap, it might not be that authentic experience. So in that sense, speech is primordial. Speech is the immediate, what Culler says here in this particular quote. Speech is the immediate manifestation or presence of thought. So if speech is immediate, then how would we term writing? Then writing, Culler says, operates in the absence of the speaker. We all study literature, we all study Shakespeare, we read Wordsworth, we are reading Eugene O'Neill, we are reading this entire canon of English literature. But what is very, very interesting is none of those artists are alive today. We have this huge industry that is Shakespearean criticism today. Yes, so if I make a small survey, I can tell you that there would be more than 500 volumes that would appear on Shakespeare alone, in terms of Shakespearean criticism alone, every year. And Shakespeare is not here to defend what the critics are talking about. So in that sense, writing would operate in the absence of the speaker. And because the speaker is not present, writing is treated as something artificial, as something that is derivative. So it's not speech exactly, it's only a representation of the speech. The authentic Hamlet would be something that Shakespeare recited while he wrote it. The Hamlet that we study today or we read today might not be that same Hamlet that Shakespeare originated. Yes? So, if speech is primordial, if speech is complete, then writing is something that is artificial and it's a derivative representation of speech. So we understand speech as something that is primordial, that is something sacrosanct. We understand that speech is something that is closest to thought. Writing is seen as something derivative and can function independent of the speaker. I give you an example of Shakespeare. We are reading Shakespeare's plays, but Shakespeare is no longer there, so we don't need Shakespeare, the person. So in that sense, Western philosophy has clearly made this division or clearly made this inference that speech, that writing is inferior to speech. Please forgive my typo on the last line. Writing is inferior to speech. Now, if I am trying to understand writing, then the notion that the written word is a sign is the reality, something that we observe, the work. It has a long history in Western thought. Aristotle talked about spoken words, which are symbols of mental experience, and written words that are symbols of the spoken, right? So in that sense, speech is treated as something that is a part of the mental experience, and writing is seen as something that is a symbol of the spoken. Even Rousseau mentioned that writing is nothing but a representation of speech. All right? So there's this huge debate that's happening in deconstruction with Derrida and philosophy, that writing is something that's very, very inferior to speech. Now, if I come into linguistics proper, and I come into the concepts of Leonard Saussure and this entire notion of logocentrism, then we understand that Saussure brought out three ideas: the signifier, the signified, and the linguistic sign. Now, what do we mean by all this? The signifier is a sound that we emanate when we are speaking. All right? So there's this phonetic aspect to language. Yes? Signified would mean the concept behind that word. For example, if I use a term, what Saussure had mentioned in his linguistics, in his work, Corpus de Linguistics, Saussure talked about this entire symbolism of the tree. Now, the concept of the tree and the phonetic tree are two different things. In the sense, when I talk about the image of the tree, or when I speak about the tree, then the sound image and the sound and the concept get together. Fine? So in the same way, if I ask you to shut your eyes and to visualize a tiger, then you would visualize it. The moment I say tiger, there would be this image of the tiger that accompanies it. So in the sense, the signifier and the signified have to get together. Only then would you have the sign. Only then would meaning originate. So when you understand absurd drama or absurd theatre, especially with Beckett and Pinter and Ionesco, and we are trying to understand how language, there's a dysfunctionality in language, or suddenly language does not make sense, we have to understand it as a small disjunct. There's a small rupture between this union between the signifier and the signified. In a larger sense, the sign is missing. For example, in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, you will find that there's nothing happening. Vladimir and Estragon are continuously waiting, and that waiting itself suggests or infers to the lack of the sign. Yes? So Ferdinand Saussure's course in general linguistics, Saussure made a very influential distinction between the signifier and the signified, and he also told you something that's very, very important In the sense, language is arbitrary, and the relationship between the signifier and the signified, it's an arbitrary relationship. For example, if I use a term, if I utter the word tree, then it might not mean the image of the tree that I have. I can call the tree a paper cup also. It would make no difference. My name is Balaji Ranganathan. Yes, you can call me by any other name. It would make no difference. Because there's no direct relationship between language and the real world. So in that sense, language, the relationship between language and the real world is a symbolic relationship. Yes? So, it's an arbitrary thing. I can technically use any term for anything. There would be no referentiality. There would be nothing that is permanent in language. So, a tree can become a tiger can become a pen can become a swan can become anything. So that means language is something that is not fixed, right? So what we understand as a relationship between the signifier and signified is only a conventional one, and that convention we should term it, or we can call it, a code. So a linguistic code. So in the sense, when I say tree, there's an image of a tree, there's a sign, there's a drawing of a tree in my mind. Yes? So that's a code. So that's where I can say the signifier and the signified have combined, and because of this, there's a linguistic sign of the word tree coming in. Yeah? Derrida, when he's critiquing Saussure, and he's talking about the arbitrary relationship of the sign, brings about this notion of différance. And he also talks about this entire concept of deferral, or a postponement in meaning. Now, when I understand language is arbitrary and language is something that is not corresponding to the reality around me, that means there is no absolute meaning. What we understand as meaning might not be meaning at all. Hence, if two individuals are speaking to each other, or in the process, I am talking to you right now, within the notion of deferral, you must understand that there is no meaning happening. You might be understanding me. You're understanding me only because the sign and the signified are combining to form the linguistic sign. But in reality, there is nothing like absolute state of meaning. What I'm speaking right now can be developed further by somebody else. So if Derrida is talking about deconstruction, you might have a philosopher tomorrow who is going to rework the entire concepts of Derrida. So in the sense, there's nothing like absolute meaning. So meaning is continuously getting postponed, right? And this is something that we watch and see in absurd drama. And this is something that we see in literature, because after nearly 400 years after Shakespeare, we are still discovering meanings within Shakespeare. After close to 150 years after Wordsworth, we are still discovering meanings within Wordsworth. And it's unlike science, because in science, you have something called absolute meaning. In the sense, 2 + 2 = 4. So you have a hypothesis. Hypothesis has to move through a referential stage, right? Where there's an inferential stage, you have an observation stage, and from there, if the hypothesis comes through, then it becomes a law. But that does not function within arts, because in the entire system of arts and philosophy, what we have is what could be the notion of truth and what could be the notion of absolute reality. And within the arts, there's nothing like an absolute thing. That's why there's this constant attempt at evolution. That's why literary criticism, post-structuralism is in a constant state of evolution. So what we understand as this entire canon of literary criticism, we have to understand it as evolution in the search for absolute meaning. which is never ever going to happen. So it's not going to happen because meaning is postponed. Derrida uses the term différance. So language functions, let me use two terms, difference and deference. Difference would mean language works on binary oppositions. When I say binary oppositions, I'm talking about how a state of opposites brings in the meaning. For example, if I use black, then there has to be posited against white. It's also posited against a large number of other colors. So if I say use the term good, then there has to be something that's bad. If I say there's if I use a word bravery, then you need cowardice. So language functions on a system of opposites, the binary opposition. So Derrida is also talking about how these binary oppositions are also leading you to a process of delay. All right? So difference, and because language is arbitrary, meaning is not happening, so meaning is getting deferred. So deference. Yes? And remember a very famous statement from a work by Derrida of grammatology when he says, Il n'y a pas de hors texte, or there's nothing outside the text. Because remember, Derrida he is a French citizen and he wrote in French. And Derrida's text of grammatology was translated by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, who is a very major thinker within postcolonial studies today, especially after her major subaltern work that came out, Can the Subaltern Speak? And along with that, you also have this second work of hers when she's talking about the death of a discipline, when she's talking about the entire evolution and the death of comparative literature in the US. Yes? So, il n'y a pas de hors texte, or there's nothing outside the text. That's what Derrida mentions in a very famous statement of his. I think I talked about this in the entire notion of deference. So here what we are looking at is how Saussure is talking about language and the entire problem of the phoneme. Yes? And he's also talking about how you have the mechanism of language, which is based on oppositions, the binary oppositions, the phonic and the conceptual. Yeah, the phonic and the conceptual. And you can also use the entire idea of the binary oppositions in language. What Derrida in Deconstruction talks about is this entire problem of binary oppositions and this entire problem of speech being superior to writing can also be applied to philosophy. And Derrida will tell you that the entire mechanism of language is based on this binary oppositions of words like light versus dark, male versus female, good versus bad, speech versus writing, nature versus culture, and so on. Now, what does this lead you to? Because philosophy and the world and the reality around us is constantly constructed within the binary. And being constructed within the binary, you're constantly having one thing or the other being situated at the center. The idea of the center in philosophy is logos. Yes? So the idea of the center within language would mean the moment. So it's the center which is always problematic, which leads you to a huge number of discourses. I can talk about the Brahminical discourses, I can talk about the Dalit discourses, I can talk about the tribal discourses, in which constantly, in a Brahminical discourse, you're going to have the entire ideology of Brahmanism coming in the center. If I talk about the Dalit discourse today, you have the discourse of the Dalit coming in the center. If I talk about the tribal discourse today, you have the discourse of the tribal coming in the center. Yes? All other discourses would come on to the margins. Fine? So, the entire notion of deconstruction is this shift of the center. Center as seen as something that is permanent. Logos, which is permanent in philosophy, has to be shifted out. The moment you shift the center, The moment you decenter, automatically something has to take its place. That means something from the margin would come in. Yes? Now, if something comes in from the margin, then that thing would become the center. But we must understand that language is not something that is permanent. Language is arbitrary. Language is deferred. Meaning is deferred. Différance. That's what Derrida tells you. So, there's nothing that can occupy the center permanently. Yes? So, in deconstruction, especially with the deconstructive technique with Derrida, would mean that there is no logocentrism at all. Everything is in a constant state of a flux. Everything is constantly changing. And as a result, what you have is, there's no center. There's this constant movement. There's this constant churning that is happening. And what has long dominated Western philosophy, the concept of logos, the concept of presence, the idea of the center, is something that's removed. And that's something revolutionary. That's something really revolutionary, because it has made a huge number of other discourses possible. And especially when we start understanding postmodernism, we'll try and understand how this is happening. So, what Derrida tells you is that oppositions, the binary oppositions, or what I was talking about, the light versus dark, male versus female, good versus bad, speech, writing, nature and culture and so on, is something that creates a hierarchy. Yeah? So, if I say light, then light is superior to darkness. If I use the term male, then it's a patriarchal discourse. Patriarchal discourse is superior to the feminist one here. Suppose I use the term female versus male, then the feminist discourse is superior to the patriarchal one. In that sense, there's a hierarchy. So this hierarchy would mean the first one is something that is authentic. The first term is something that is presence. The first term is seen as something that is the essence of logos. So if I say light versus dark, light would be the authentic. Dark is something that is derivative of light. In the sense, there is a shadow only because there is light. That's the whole idea. Yeah? So this hierarchy creates what could be termed as the privileged spaces and the unprivileged spaces. And Derrida tells you that this inequality and hierarchy is actually created by this tendency within Western philosophy, where presence is privileged over absence. And Heidegger would use a very, very famous term for this phrase, and he calls it the metaphysics of presence. Or metaphysics would be something that understands the meaning of the presence. All right, it would be a part of your logics and philosophy and so on, logics within philosophy and so on. So when I use the term metaphysics of presence, I'm talking about what Heidegger mentioned, the logics of the presence. So if I sum up, Derrida talks about three major ideas. One, he talks about the logos. He talks about logocentrism. He critiques language as something that is logocentric. So in that sense, he deconstructs his entire notion that speech is superior to writing. What he actually comes about and says, there's essentially no difference between speech and writing. That's what he's trying to tell you, because the moment you have deconstruction happening, there's no center, there's no speech as something central. Yeah. And he also talks about the concept of deference or postponement of meaning. It's precisely the postponement of meaning that is leading you to this entire notion of a lack of the center. Yes? Now, if I come down to postmodernism, now how do I understand what is postmodernism? Because I'm supposed to speak on two ideas today. Now, if I look at postmodernism, then I understand postmodernism as a movement in architecture. It's not something that has happened within literature. We must also understand that much of the isms that we study, whether it's surrealism or Dadaism or modernism or postmodernism, it's not something that originated within literary studies per se, in its truest sense. Most of these isms that have risen up have come up within the other arts. For example, architecture or sculpture or painting or so on and so forth. Yeah. So we have to understand two basic ideas, modernism and postmodernism. Because when I say postmodernism, I'm talking about a condition that happened after modernism spent its energy. All right. So postmodernism began as a movement in architecture, and postmodernism, what it did was it rejected this entire notion of modernism, the older form. Yeah. And what it brought out was this entire avant-garde passion for the new, in the sense they wanted to explore new forms, new ideas, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So if you're trying to understand what is postmodernism, you could look at Indian English poetry, and if you look at the modernist poets within English poetry today, you would have the old greats, Nizam Ezekiel, K.K. Darwala, Giv Patel, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But is there a postmodernism within Indian poetry, Indian English poetry? Yeah. Has there been a change within that modernist stance that came about? Is there something called postmodern painting within India? Because the modernist painting began with the progressive arts group, and you had M.F. Hussain, you had Raza, you had Bhupen Kakkar, and so a large number of painters, and they brought about this huge change in Indian painting, and that painting moved away from the Bengal school of painting of Tagore, and it also moved away from this entire notion of company art that was happening. So if you're trying to understand how this change is happening, then we understand that there is something that has happened to modernism. Yes? So if we understand postmodernism, then we have to understand it as a rejection of the older forms of knowledge, where you're trying to create new forms, yeah, and you're trying to explore new possibilities. At the same time, you're trying to understand individuality. So the individual and postmodernism are two things we need to keep in mind. If I'm trying to understand modernism and the valorization of the new, it was rejected in the 50s and 60s, in the 1950s and 1960s when it first came in, for some very conservative reasons. So in the sense, modernism rejected some very new ideas that used to come in the 50s, 60s, in the sense they wanted to maintain those elements of modern utility. At the same time, they were trying to return back to the classical images of the past. And because of this, you have some very iconic architecture today. For example, in the city of Ahmedabad, we are very lucky in that sense to have buildings designed and constructed by some of the most venerated architects in the history of architecture, namely Louis Kahn and Le Corbusier. So Louis Kahn designed the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, right? The entire imposing facade that you see. And Le Corbusier designed the Ahmedabad Mill Owners Association building here, and he designed Tagore Hall in Paldi area. When you start examining the designs that they created, then you understand that there was a functionality that was associated with a modern design. How would I say that it's a modern design? Because it completely differs from the older colonial structures. Yes? So in that sense, you would find that there was this play of light, there was this play of the breeze, there was a play of space. You also had lines which were very, very different from the older colonial constructions. So in that sense, modernism, what it did was, it tried to be conservative in the sense they tried to preserve the basic functionality that was present within architecture, older architecture. At the same time, they wanted to present something new. So it was a blend of the classical, and it was a blend of this new avant-garde notion of reworking the old. Yeah, so they actually functioned on combinations of already created patterns. Now, if I talk about postmodernism, then we need to understand three terms, in the sense pre-modernism, modernism, and postmodernism. So, because it's useless to talk about postmodernism if you're not going to go back towards what modernism meant and what pre-modern meant. Now, when I talk about pre-modernism, I'm talking about how original meaning was actually possessed by the authority. For example, let's say the religious institutions, the Catholic Church or the mathas in India, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So in the sense, when I talk about pre-modernism, I'm talking about this entire idea of tradition controlling the present. When I talk about tradition, I'm talking about the paramparas. In a sense, it's the parampara, the tradition, which decides how the present has to move. It has to decide how an individual functions. It decides how a society functions, and so on and so forth. In a sense, you don't have much scope for individuality because you're already functioning within defined structures. You're already functioning within given structures. You're already functioning within structures that are already present even before you're born. Yes, so you're just born into the structure, and being born in that structure, you never realize how much of a slave we become to structures. So most of these structures are something that are given, all right? So in the sense, it would be tradition. Remember Eliot's essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, the long canon of literary criticism, the notion of good poetry. So when I talk about the notion of good poetry, or something what Matthew Arnold was talking about with his touchstone criticism, it actually meant moving in the footsteps of your forefathers, moving in the footsteps of those people, the artists who created objects of excellence. You know, Homer, Dante, Eliot, Ezra Pound, Joyce, within the moderns today. So anything that does not come up to the notion of excellence is something that is not good. Now, this creates major problems, because if I say something that existed in the past is very, very good, then would that be the authentic experience? Would that mean, let's say, nothing is ever possible after the Ramcharitmanasa of Tulsidas or the Ramayana of Valmiki, the Silapatikaram, the Tamil epic, or the Manimekalai, the Tamil epic, or the Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, you know, the Greek epics, Aeneid, the Roman one, Virgil. Yeah. So does that actually mean that nothing can be replicated after that? So that's the notion of tradition. That's the idea of tradition as something that is central, something that is primordial, something that is the notion of excellence. All right, and nothing else that follows after it can ever be replicated. No, that is the notion of the pre-modern or pre-modernism. But if I talk about modernism, then we are talking about this entire Enlightenment project, the humanistic project that came up in the 19th century. It was a philosophical movement which privileged reason and science over tradition. Yeah, natural science. Remember Darwin, Charles Darwin, and the entire evolutionary theory that came about with him. Remember Freud, Sigmund Freud, and the entire idea of the Oedipal, the pre-Oedipal, and the Oedipal conflict that he brought about. And in a larger sense, it reoriented, it redrew, it reconstructed rationality. At the same time, it reconstructed the individual. Yes. So this was a larger. So if I try and understand the works of Freud, if I try and understand the work of Charles Darwin, especially with the origin of species and evolutionary biology, evolutionary knowledge, then we must understand this as a larger rejection of tradition. Now, this has been formed as how an individual is functioning, right? The Cartesian logic, the Cartesian cogito, Descartes talked about cogito ergo sum, in the sense, I think, therefore I am. Now, if I say I think, and because I think I exist, this would mean a large question against parampara. This would mean a large question against tradition, because tradition does not allow you to think. Tradition would say, follow in the footsteps of the old. Yes? So, modernism, in a larger sense, tried to react to the entire idea of the pre-modern. What the postmodern does, or postmodernism does, is it rejects this collective idea or the anonymous experience of modernism. Because modernism, in a way, tends to, because it's influenced by the sciences, it tends to reduce everything. Now, if I say, how does science reduce? Then we must understand that matter is composed of atoms. Yes? So all of us are composed of atoms. Even the studio I'm talking in is composed of atoms. The television camera in front of me is composed of atoms. If everything is an atom, then where am I? Where is individuality? So in that sense, modernism is anonymous. Yes? And this anonymous experience is something that is challenged by postmodernism. Postmodernism would resituate, rebring, recenter the individual experience. And it would say that we are not anonymous, we cannot be reduced like what the sciences does, in the sense everything is reduced to an atom. Postmodernism would say, no, I am diversity. We are a part of diversity. The world is a part of diversity. And the world and postmodernism and the world actually celebrates this diversity. So if I'm trying to understand the facets of postmodernism, there are a few points that I have here. One, we're talking about extreme self-reflexivity, in the sense, I am the self, I am there, I exist, I'm not anonymous, I'm not reducible to an atom. I am a thinking individual. Yes? So I react against modernism. Second, I bring out the problems of existence. So postmodernism would bring out irony and parody, the problems of existence. Third, because modernism reacted against parampara or tradition, postmodernism would also look at this breakdown. Because it's not a complete break away from modernism, remember. Postmodernism has elements of modernism within. Yes, but it differs in its ideology. It differs in situating experience, self-experience. So it would also bring about a breakdown within high and low cultures. It would go retro. When I say retro, it would go back to the past. Please remember your FM programs on radio in the middle of the night, where you have the retro program, where all the older forms of music, the older songs of different eras, different older singers, the very popular programs that come in, they would start coming in. All right, so you go retro. So you'll find this happening in fashion, you'll have this in architecture, you would have this in art, and so on and so forth. It would also question, and this is a very important point, it would question something called a grand narrative. A grand narrative would mean logocentrism. It would mean presence. It's something that critiques that. And lastly, it would critique the entire creation of visuality. That's why today's films are very, very different from the films that were present in the 70s and the 30s. It was a pleasure talking to you all. I hope that most of you will start reading further on into postmodernism and deconstruction. It would be a pleasure to help you all, and I hope to meet you all again. Thank you so much.